August 30th, 1944. Eastern France. The air inside Patton's command tent carried the smell of canvas, cigarette smoke, and dust from roads churned by armor. Maps covered every surface. Red arrows traced the Third Army's lightning advance, 300 miles in 3 weeks. His tanks had crossed the Meuse. The Moselle lay just ahead. Beyond that, the Rhine. Beyond that, Germany's heart. Patton stood over the map table, his polished helmet catching lamplight, his jaw set in the expression his staff knew too well. Outside, the sound of idling engines had gone silent. Not from rest, from empty fuel tanks. His spearhead stopped, not by the Wehrmacht, by arithmetic, by supply trucks that couldn't keep pace with victory, by a crisis no amount of audacity could overcome. 2 months earlier, the Allied armies had been trapped in Normandy's hedgerows. Operation Overlord had succeeded in putting men ashore, but the breakout had stalled. German forces fought with desperate skill through bocage country, thick hedges and sunken lanes that turned every field into a fortress. Progress measured in yards. Casualties mounted daily. By late July, the beachhead felt like a cage. Then came Operation Cobra. On July 25th, 1944, American bombers carpeted German positions south of St. Lo with thousands of tons of explosives. The earth itself seemed to convulse. When the smoke cleared, the German 7th Army's left flank had been obliterated. General Omar Bradley's 1st Army punched through. Behind them came Patton's 3rd Army, activated on August 1st and unleashed like a pack of wolves. Patton had waited months for this moment. Sidelined after the slapping incidents in Sicily, humiliated by a phantom army command designed to deceive German intelligence, he had burned with impatience while other men led the invasion. Now he had his chance. 3rd Army didn't advance. It exploded across France. Patton's armored columns moved faster than any army in history. They bypassed German strong points, ignored their flanks, and drove east with a singular obsession: speed. The Brittany ports, Bradley's original objective, became secondary. Patton sent only minimum forces west. His main strength aimed for the Seine, for Paris, for the German border itself. By mid-August, German forces in France were collapsing. The Falaise pocket had closed, trapping and destroying much of 2 German armies. Tens of thousands surrendered. Equipment lay abandoned across Normandy. Hitler's commanders in the west faced annihilation. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHEF, had predicted the war might end by Christmas. Some whispered it could be over by autumn. The Germans were reeling. France was being liberated town by town, sometimes without a shot fired. Patton's tanks reached the Seine on August 19th. They crossed it 5 days later. Ahead lay the Marne, the Meuse, the Moselle. Ahead lay the Siegfried Line, Hitler's western wall, still undermanned, still vulnerable. Patton could taste victory, but 300 miles behind the spearhead, the logistics officers were drowning in impossible mathematics. The invasion planners had built their timelines around one assumption: a methodical advance. They expected Allied forces to reach the Seine by D-Day plus 90, early September. They expected to capture the Channel ports, Calais, Boulogne, Antwerp, and use them to funnel supplies forward. They expected railroads to be rebuilt, pipelines to be laid, depots to be established in careful sequence. Instead, the breakout had happened 6 weeks early. Patton's tanks were 300 miles ahead of schedule. The carefully constructed supply plan had shattered against the reality of rapid victory. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, every ration still came through Normandy beaches or the small port of Cherbourg. From there, trucks carried everything forward along a single overworked road network the French called Routes Nationales. The Americans called it something else: the Red Ball Express. Named after a railroad term for priority freight, the Red Ball Express became a lifeline stretched to breaking. Truck convoys ran 24 hours a day. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers in segregated units, pushed their vehicles to destruction. They drove without sleep, without lights at night, racing against the clock and the advancing armies. Breakdowns were constant. Tires disintegrated. Engines overheated. Vehicles were cannibalized for parts, abandoned along roadsides when they could give no more. Each round trip from Normandy to the front took days. Fuel was consumed just to deliver fuel. The system hemorrhaged efficiency with every mile the armies advanced. By late August, Third Army alone needed 400,000 gallons of gasoline daily. The trucks could deliver less than half that amount. Other needs competed with fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement parts. Everything traveled the same clogged roads. Priorities shifted daily. One army got fuel while another went hungry. Airfields needed aviation gasoline. Hospitals needed plasma. Engineers needed bridging equipment. The logistics staff juggled impossible demands with dwindling resources. Meanwhile, Patton's tanks didn't just use fuel, they devoured it. A Sherman tank consumed 1 gallon for every 2 miles traveled. Patton's armor divisions covered 40 miles on good days. His supply officers watched fuel levels drop like water from a cracked vessel. They sent urgent requests. They begged. They pleaded. The response was always the same. There isn't enough. To the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group faced the same crisis. British and Canadian forces had pushed through Belgium, liberating Brussels on September 3rd. But Montgomery's tanks, too, were running dry. More critically, Montgomery had the ear of Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower. He proposed a bold plan, a concentrated thrust north through Holland, across the Rhine at Arnhem, into Germany's industrial Ruhr region. One powerful spearhead, all resources behind it. Operation Market Garden. It would require fuel, vast quantities of fuel that would have to come from somewhere. Eisenhower faced the oldest dilemma of coalition command. Too many generals, too many plans, not enough supplies. Every commander believed his axis of advance would end the war. Every commander believed the enemy in front of him was on the verge of collapse. Every commander needed fuel, and there simply wasn't enough to go around. George Smith Patton Jr. had studied war his entire life. Cavalry charges, tank warfare, blitzkrieg. He understood one principle above all others: momentum. An army in motion created its own opportunities. It dislocated enemy defenses, shattered morale, prevented regrouping. An army that stopped gave the enemy time to dig in, time to reinforce, time to prepare. Throughout late August, Patton watched his advantage evaporate with every empty fuel gauge. His forward elements were within striking distance of the Siegfried Line. Intelligence reports confirmed what he suspected. The fortifications were lightly manned. Most units defending the west wall were remnants, stragglers, rear echelon troops pressed into service. One sharp blow could rupture the line before it could be reinforced. He could be across the Rhine by mid-September. He could be in Frankfurt before autumn. Instead, his divisions sat motionless, their crews standing beside silent machines. Patton's frustration was not simply professional, it was visceral. He believed deeply, almost mystically, in his own destiny. He had commanded armor in World War I. He had pioneered American tank doctrine between the wars. He had crushed the Afrika Korps in Tunisia, conquered Sicily, now liberated France. This was his moment. History had placed him here for this purpose. And logistics was denying him immortality. He fired off messages to Bradley. He called SHAF. He argued, cajoled, demanded. His language grew colorful, profane. He accused Montgomery of hoarding supplies. He accused Eisenhower of timidity. He accused staff officers of bureaucratic cowardice. Give him the fuel, he promised, and he would hand them Germany in weeks. Deny him, and they would fight through winter, through snow, through needless blood. The enemy was beaten. They simply hadn't been told yet. Angle 2. Eisenhower's dilemma. Supreme command under pressure. Dwight Eisenhower carried responsibilities Patton never had to consider. He commanded not just armies, but nations. British, American, Canadian, French, Polish forces, all under his authority. Political pressures weighed as heavily as military ones. Churchill wanted results. Roosevelt wanted results. The combined chiefs of staff demanded progress reports. Public opinion in both countries expected swift victory after Normandy's success. Yet Eisenhower also understood what the newspapers did not. The Wehrmacht remained dangerous. German forces were retreating, yes, but they were not routed. They were falling back to prepare defenses. Every mile closer to Germany shortened their supply lines while lengthening Allied ones. The fuel crisis was not a failure of will. It was mathematical reality. Eisenhower favored what he called the broad front strategy. Advance along the entire line, keep pressure everywhere, prevent the Germans from concentrating reserves against any single thrust. It was methodical. It was careful. It was designed to minimize risk and maximize coalition cohesion. Patton's plan, a single armored spearhead driving deep into Germany, carried immense risk. If Third Army outran its supplies and got cut off, it could be surrounded, destroyed. If Patton's thrust failed, it would consume resources that might have kept the broad advance moving. Eisenhower trusted Patton's aggressive instincts, but he also knew the man's weaknesses, his impulsiveness, his disregard for flanks, his willingness to gamble everything on intuition. More pressingly, Eisenhower had to balance American and British interests. Montgomery was not just a field marshal. He was a national hero, Britain's most celebrated commander. Denying him resources while favoring Patton could fracture the alliance. Churchill would protest. British newspapers would cry favoritism. The political cost might outweigh any tactical gain. The men driving the Red Ball Express trucks rarely saw the front lines. Their war was fought on roads, in maintenance yards, at fuel dumps. They worked in shifts that blurred into continuous motion. Sleep came in stolen minutes. Meals were eaten behind the wheel. The segregated nature of many transport units meant African-American soldiers bore disproportionate burdens, driving the worst routes, receiving the worst equipment, yet expected to perform miracles. They did. Convoys pushed through rain, through darkness, through mechanical failure. When trucks broke down, drivers transferred cargo to other vehicles and kept moving. When enemy aircraft strafed the roads, they scattered and regrouped. The statistics told the story. By September, 2/3 of all supplies reaching the front came by truck. The Red Ball Express moved over 12,000 tons daily at its peak. But even heroism had limits. The distance from Normandy to Patton's forward positions exceeded 400 miles. A round trip consumed a week. Trucks needed fuel themselves, fuel that couldn't be delivered to combat units. Tires wore out in days instead of months. Replacement parts became scarce. The French road network, damaged by years of war, crumbled under the weight. Bridges failed. Detours added miles. Traffic jams stretched for hours. Logistics officers calculated that for every gallon delivered to a tank at the front, 2 more gallons were burned in transit. The system was consuming itself. Staff planners begged for time. Time to bring Antwerp online, time to repair railroads, time to establish forward depots. But time was exactly what the battlefield commanders refused to give. Bernard Montgomery saw the same opportunity Patton did, a chance to end the war in 1944. His plan was elegant in its ambition. Drop 3 airborne divisions to seize bridges across Dutch rivers, then drive armored columns through the corridor and across the Rhine at Arnhem. From there, wheel east into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. Cut off coal and steel production, and the Wehrmacht would collapse. Market Garden required massive resources, transport aircraft, fuel for armor, artillery support, bridging equipment. It also required Eisenhower's approval. Montgomery pressed his case with characteristic confidence. The plan was bold, decisive, exactly the kind of concentrated thrust that could break German resistance before winter. Eisenhower, perhaps swayed by political considerations, perhaps genuinely convinced, gave his blessing. Market Garden would launch in mid-September. The decision meant fuel and supplies would flow north to British Second Army, not east to Patton's Third. Montgomery's claim took priority. Patton, learning of the allocation, erupted in fury. He saw it as favoritism, as politics overruling military sense. His army was already positioned, already engaged, already threatening the German heartland. Montgomery would have to advance through difficult terrain, across multiple river barriers, against stiffening resistance. Patton's route was open, if only someone would give him gasoline. German commanders in the West had faced catastrophe in August. Model after model had been destroyed. Paris lost. Belgium lost. The Americans were approaching the Reich's borders with terrifying speed. Field Marshal Walter Model, recently appointed to command Army Group B, worked frantically to stabilize a collapsing front. The call came through on August 31st, 1944. Patton's chief of staff, Major General Hugh Gaffey, had been working the phones for days, trying to shake loose fuel from any source. First Army depots, captured German stocks, even British reserves. Nothing had worked. Third Army's spearhead divisions reported fuel levels below 25%. Some tank battalions were completely dry. The advance had simply stopped. Patton himself got on the line to Bradley's headquarters. His voice carried the barely controlled rage his staff recognized. He needed fuel. Not next week. Not when the supply plan caught up. Now. Today. His lead elements were 50 miles from the German border. The Siegfried Line lay exposed. Every hour of delay allowed the enemy to reinforce positions that should have been overrun while they were vulnerable. Bradley listened. He sympathized. He also had no fuel to give. First Army faced the same shortages. Hodge's divisions were rationing ammunition. The entire supply system was paralyzed by distance and demand. Bradley suggested Patton make his case directly to Eisenhower. Patton needed no encouragement. He dictated messages. He sent liaison officers to SHAEF headquarters in Granville. He made it clear, explicitly, colorfully clear, that history was being squandered for want of gasoline. His words reached Eisenhower's ears through multiple channels, each version more urgent than the last. Third Army was being strangled not by the Wehrmacht, but by its own logistics. The opportunity to end the war in 1944 was slipping away, gallon by gallon. Eisenhower faced the decision he had been dreading. He could not supply everyone. The mathematics were unforgiving. Montgomery's Market Garden offensive required priority allocation. The plan was already in motion, resources committed, airborne divisions preparing. Yet Eisenhower also understood what Patton represented. The most aggressive, most successful commander in the European theater stopped at the moment of greatest opportunity. The political consequences of completely abandoning Third Army would be severe. American press and public opinion had embraced Patton despite his controversies. He delivered victories. He embodied the offensive spirit. To ground his army entirely while supporting a British operation would feed accusations of favoritism that already simmered beneath the alliance's surface. The Supreme Commander made his decision. He would not divert resources from Market Garden. That operation would proceed as planned. But he would not abandon Patton either. Third Army would receive additional fuel allocations, enough to resume limited operations, enough to maintain pressure on the German border. Not enough for the deep thrust Patton wanted, but enough to keep his divisions engaged. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, conveyed the message to Third Army headquarters. The exact words varied in later accounts, but the substance remained consistent across sources. Eisenhower had said to tell Patton he could have what he needed to continue operations. Some versions quoted the Supreme Commander more directly. Tell Patton he can have anything he wants. The phrase captured both Eisenhower's respect for Patton's achievements and the impossible position in which Coalition Command had placed him. The message reached Patton's headquarters on September 2nd. For a brief moment, his staff saw something like satisfaction cross their commander's face. Vindication. Recognition. Eisenhower understood what was at stake. Third Army would move again. Fuel trucks were already being diverted from other sectors. Additional allocations would arrive within days. But the reality fell short of the promise. The fuel that arrived was measured, controlled, insufficient for the grand offensive Patton envisioned. He received enough gasoline to advance his forward divisions another 50 miles, enough to maintain contact with German forces withdrawing toward the West Wall, but not enough to execute the deep exploitation he had planned. His staff calculated the numbers. To reach the Rhine and establish bridgeheads would require 3 times the allocation they received. To drive into Germany's interior would require 10 times that amount. Eisenhower's directive sounded generous. Anything he wants, but the execution was constrained by the same logistical limits that had created the crisis in the first place. Patton could have what he wanted, but only if what he wanted fit within the narrow margins of what the supply system could actually deliver. Third Army resumed its advance on September 5th. 12 Corps pushed toward the Moselle River. XX Corps moved on Metz, the ancient fortress city that guarded the approaches to the Saar region. Resistance stiffened immediately. The Germans Patton had hoped to catch in flight had used the pause to dig in. The West Wall's fortifications, largely unmanned in late August, now bristled with troops rushed from other sectors. Artillery positions that could have been overrun were now occupied and ranged. The fleeting window of vulnerability had closed. What should have been a pursuit became a siege. What should have been exploitation became attrition. Patton's tanks reached the Moselle on September 6th and found the bridges destroyed, the far bank fortified, the crossing contested by troops who had found time to prepare. The frustration Patton felt was shared by his soldiers. Tank crews who had driven across France in weeks now sat in concealed positions, watching German engineers strengthen bunkers across the river. Infantry who had liberated towns without firing a shot now prepared for house-to-house fighting. The momentum that had defined Third Army's campaign had evaporated. Staff officers tried to calculate how many miles had been lost, how many days, how many opportunities. The numbers were meaningless. What mattered was the feeling, shared from division commanders down to riflemen, that they had been on the edge of something historic and had been pulled back at the last moment. Not by enemy action, not by tactical failure, by fuel gauges reading empty. To the north, Montgomery's market garden launched on September 17th. It was the concentrated thrust Eisenhower had approved, the single spearhead that consumed the resources Patton had requested. Paratroopers dropped on Eindhoven, Nijmegen, Arnhem. British armor drove up the narrow corridor. For 9 days, the battle raged. In the end, it failed. The bridge at Arnhem, the bridge too far, could not be held. Allied airborne forces were evacuated or captured. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The Ruhr remained out of reach. The fuel and supplies that might have sustained Patton's advance had been spent on an operation that accomplished nothing strategic. The irony was not lost on Third Army staff. Patton himself said little publicly, but his diary entries from September spoke volumes about missed chances and wasted potential. By month's end, both Third Army and 21st Army Group had transitioned from mobile warfare to grinding positional fighting. The race across France was over. The quick victory that had seemed inevitable in late August faded into cold autumn rain and the grim realization that the war would continue through winter. Eisenhower's broad front strategy reasserted itself by default, not through planning, but through exhaustion. Every army group along the line faced supply shortages, stiffening resistance, fortified positions. The fluid battlefield of August hardened into the static lines of September. The fuel crisis that had stopped Patton became the supply crisis that stopped everyone. Third Army's halt at the Moselle in early September gave the German Wehrmacht something it desperately needed: time. Field Marshal Model used those critical days to orchestrate what German military historians would later call a miracle of improvisation. Units shattered in France were reconstituted behind the West Wall. Volkssturm militia battalions, previously relegated to rear area duties, moved into frontline fortifications. Training battalions from the Reich's interior were rushed west. Artillery pieces from quiet sectors in Norway and Denmark were transferred to the Saar region. By mid-September, what had been a thinly held frontier became a continuous defensive line. The Siegfried Line, officially the West Wall, stretched from the Swiss border to the Netherlands, a series of bunkers, tank traps, minefields, and fortified villages that German engineers had constructed in the 1930s. It had been neglected during the years of German victories, but its concrete bones remained intact. Patton's divisions reached these fortifications just as they were being reoccupied. The battle for Metz began on September 7th and would continue for 3 months. The fortress city, ringed by 19th-century forts modernized with steel and concrete, had not fallen to direct assault since the Roman era. Patton's forces battered themselves against its defenses through September and October. Each fort required individual reduction. Each required artillery, ammunition, time. The river crossings Third Army attempted were contested with ferocity that contrasted starkly with the retreating Germans of August. At Dornat, an attempted crossing on September 8th ended in disaster. An entire battalion pinned on the eastern bank, taking devastating casualties before withdrawing. The casualties Third Army suffered in September exceeded those of the entire August pursuit. The advance measured in yards per day, not miles. Further north, similar stories unfolded. First Army reached the west wall near Aachen and found the old fortress city defended street by street. The Battle of Aachen lasted from October 2nd to October 21st, reducing the ancient city to rubble. Ninth Army struggled through the Hürtgen forest, a nightmare of dense woods, mud, and German bunkers that consumed American divisions like a meat grinder. The campaign that was supposed to end the war by Christmas had bogged down into the kind of attrition warfare military planners had promised to avoid. Casualty rates climbed. Hospital units overflowed. Replacement systems struggled to fill the gaps in frontline units. The quick victory had given way to a slow, bloody grind. The strategic window Patton had identified in late August never reopened. Intelligence reports confirmed what many suspected. The Germans had been vulnerable during those critical days. Prisoner interrogations revealed that defending units in early September had been scratch formations, often without adequate weapons or ammunition. Some bunkers were manned by clerks and mechanics. Some positions had been occupied only hours before American forces arrived. Had Third Army maintained momentum, had Patton's tanks reached the West Wall in late August with fuel in their tanks, the defensive line might have been broken before it could be properly defended. But history dealt in what happened, not what might have been. The fuel crisis of late August 1944 had strategic consequences that extended far beyond Third Army's immediate frustrations. The delay allowed Germany to stabilize the Western Front at precisely the moment when stabilization should have been impossible. Hitler's regime, which had appeared on the verge of collapse following the Normandy disaster, gained months of survival. Those months allowed for the drafting of additional divisions, the production of more weapons, the fortification of defensive positions that would cost thousands of Allied lives to overcome. German armaments minister Albert Speer later wrote that the autumn of 1944 represented the Reich's last gasp of industrial productivity. Tanks, aircraft, ammunition produced in quantities that astonished Allied intelligence. That production would not have been possible if Germany's western border had been breached in September. More immediately, the stalled offensive forced a strategic reassessment at SHAEF. Eisenhower's broad front approach, criticized by Patton and Montgomery alike, became the default posture not through vindication, but through necessity. No single army group had the resources to sustain a deep penetration. The logistics crisis that had stopped Third Army applied equally to all Allied forces by October. The port of Antwerp, captured intact on September 4th, could not be used until its approaches through the Scheldt estuary were cleared, a brutal campaign that lasted through November. Until Antwerp opened, the supply situation remained critical. Fuel, ammunition, and rations continued to flow through Normandy beaches and Charbonne, traveling hundreds of miles to reach frontline units. The mathematics of logistics continued to dictate operations as much as enemy resistance. For Patton personally, September 1944 marked a turning point in his relationship with Eisenhower and the Allied command structure. The phrase, "tell Patton he can have anything he wants," became, in Patton's mind, a symbol of promises unkept. He felt betrayed not by explicit lies, but by institutional constraints that his superiors refused to overcome. His diary entries from autumn 1944 grew increasingly bitter. He saw the winter campaign as a waste, a needless prolongation of a war that could have ended if only someone had listened. His criticisms of Eisenhower, previously confined to private correspondence, began to leak into conversations with subordinates and journalists. The friction between aggressive field commanders and cautious theater leadership, an old tension in military history, crystallized in the fuel crisis. The ultimate consequence came in December. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's desperate winter counteroffensive through the Ardennes, succeeded in achieving surprise partly because Allied forces were stretched thin along the entire front. The broad front strategy, necessitated by the supply crisis, meant no sector had overwhelming strength. When German panzers attacked on December 16th, they found American positions vulnerable. Patton's Third Army, positioned to the south, would play a crucial role in relieving surrounded forces at Bastogne. The agility he demonstrated in pivoting his entire army north within days proved his operational brilliance. But it also raised the question: if Third Army had crossed the Rhine in September, if Patton's divisions had been rampaging through western Germany as he had predicted, would the Bulge have been possible? The counterfactual haunted military historians for decades. By war's end in May 1945, the fuel crisis of August 1944 had faded into the larger narrative of Allied victory. Third Army would cross the Rhine at Oppenheim in March 1945, would drive deep into Bavaria and Czechoslovakia, would earn its reputation as one of the most effective formations of the war. Eisenhower's strategic decisions, controversial at the time, appeared vindicated by ultimate success.